Hi there. I wonder how you are today, and it's great you could join us. But who are you? When you're asked that question, it could be answered in so many different ways. Maybe you just reply with your name, or you're saying so and so's gran, or I'm here to pick up a delivery. Sometimes we may ask the question of our own selves, and we wonder who we are. So if you're kind of new somewhere, well, quite often people will be asking that to suss us out and wondering what we are about. And sometimes it's hard to tell, or we're taken by surprise. And I recall that happening when I moved down south to England, and I was just settling down, and I was invited as a guest after church to this rather grand house for Sunday lunch. And the host had invited a few other guests, and I was the newbie in the church, and I think I was getting sussed out. I was young at the time, and I still was getting used to adult company, and after moving away from home and just finding my own feet. And the conversation at the table focused on a few topics, and it was going well. But then it settled on my dad. Now, just to let you know where things are in that, my dad, in terms of his story, he was like a Terry Waite of the 1950s when he was captured by the Red Army when the communists under Mao Zedong invaded Tibet. And he was a missionary there, and being found there, he was imprisoned, and he was imprisoned for 3 years, 1 year solitary confinement. Now, to cut a long story short, his life story in prison under the communists meant that when he was released, thankfully, people just wanted to hear his story because it was a remarkable story under adversity, and at that time he became quite well known. So I grew up in that shadow of being called Jeffrey T. Bull's son. For me, he was just my dad. So when I was invited to this lunch, some of the guests knew the connection, and another guest, kind of larger than life woman who had an opinion about every topic in the conversation, she then made comment about my dad. She said, well, I went to listen to your dad, and I was quite surprised. He was just he was an insignificant little man. Now, she didn't stop there. She began to explain what she meant. And it looked like, well, she brought a shovel in her handbag. Well, I didn't know quite what to say, but I seemed to find the words from somewhere, and I just simply said, well, I suppose that's why God uses the foolish to confound the wise. I don't think she knew what to say after that, and she was quite quiet for the rest of the meal. But maybe that was due to the host in this rather grand house, who replied as if we were kind of in Downton Abbey, and he said, oh, touché, young chap. So we sometimes get into our minds that we think others have a particular view of us, and that's how we should have a view of ourselves. And sometimes we let others know one way or another if what we think of them, if it doesn't match up to us and our expectations, we can sometimes put that across. And obviously this woman obviously got into her mind what my dad should look like. But who are we? What are we about? I ask that for you, and as an individual, but also as a group. Or what it means for us, maybe as a church. Who are we in this day and age? Especially in this day and age when the online and social media stuff is another world, where these questions are very important, especially to those much younger than ourselves. They view it with such seriousness that it can affect their self-esteem and how they see themselves as how their friends see them, which can be very worrying for a parent. You might have grandchildren, and anytime you've had a chance to see them, they've got their eyes on their phone, and it's never far away. For some, it's their source of identity. what they look like to others and their friends and what they think of them is very important. It's such a pressure I don't think we fully understand. Our story today about John and Jesus think about the same questions. John knows who he is and what he is to do. John, Jesus' cousin, is simply referred to in this passage as John. No the Baptist at the end of his name. For the writer of the story, it's really quite deliberate. The writer wants to make it abundantly clear that John's primary function is not to stand in the River Jordan and just baptize people. Rather, the main reason is he's to witness, to point to and signpost to Jesus. See, John is described not as the light, but he came to testify to the light, to point to it. But he also knows who he is by what he's not. He's not a pretender. And with that in mind, it is then amazing that what God does. You see, God's Son is sent into the midst of humanity for this big rescue of redeeming, restoring the world, and yet God relies on a human being to signpost what that's all about. The best way of looking at that is it's like a fire station in our area. The fire service still needs our help, but it doesn't expect us to go into the fire. That's what they will do. But they expect us to signpost and alert them about what needs done. See, John was acutely aware of his own limitations. He says, I baptize you with water. Among you, one stands whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I'm not worthy to untie the thongs of his sandals. John was a helper by pointing to the one who truly helps. Learn something important from John. He knew what he was about in relation to Jesus. And he knew what that meant. He knew he had the privilege to share the news about Jesus, but he knew that that was a privilege and not a perk. Now, in the year that I was married to Ruth, we were married in a summer which was probably one of the wettest that was on record, until the day of our wedding. It was remarkable. My father-in-law was a minister and he took the wedding service on this sunny day, and one of his members, who was a guest, asked my father-in-law, looking up at the blue sky, and he said, how do you do it? He came back, he said, well, it's perks of the job actually. Now both were laughed because they knew it wasn't true, but it just shows you John was no pretender, and he had clarity about his life when he pointed the way to Jesus. He knew the privilege, but it was not a perk. He knew who he was. And when we know who we are to Jesus as one who is loved, then we understand the privilege it is, and there's no room for pretending. When we come to communion, what is happening there is that our pretend identities, the mask that we put over, is stripped away, and it reveals to God who we really are. I think probably more accurately, what is happening is that our idea of who we think we are is stripped away, and we discover ourselves what God truly sees all along. That can be alarming for some of us if we're in denial. The pride followed by the shame. The opposite can be just as true, in that we are very aware of what we're like, and we don't like what we see in ourselves, and we feel ashamed. And yet we're shocked that we're accepted and loved and find it hard to believe. And yet here at communion, it creates a level playing field that we are accepted and loved. See, in St. James, we affirm the dignity of all people. We welcome into the life of our community of faith people of every age, gender, race, country of origin, ethnic heritage, sexual orientation, mental or physical abilities or condition, education, marital or economic status, cultural or religious background. All people are welcomed and affirmed at the Lord's table and at ours. Whether we're full of ourselves or feel like an empty shell to God, God knows us better than we know ourselves. The shock and surprise is that God still loves us. There's no longer any need to pretend or to think what we have is a perk, but it's certainly a privilege. And that privilege is that what we have is good news, and it's worth sharing. We have a gift of love, so we can give it to others. Thanks for your time. It's good that you joined us, and take care.